The Seminole Nation, a presentation by Emily Tedford and Olivia Pivovar. The resilience of the Seminole Nation through the Seminole Wars and relocation to the Indian Territory led to a successful and thriving tribe within the U.S. Forming the tribe. During the 18th century, Lower Creeks migrated to Florida to escape the dominance of Upper Creeks. They searched for new fields to plant crops, and Spain even used these migrations to provide a buffer between Florida and Britain colonies. Other than Creeks, the tribe also included Uchis, Yamasees, and Aboriginal remnants. The Seminole population not only had these Native Americans, but also had runaway slaves who found refuge with the tribe. As I stated in the last slide, many Southern slaves lived on Seminole land to find shelter away from their slave owners so they wouldn't have any authority over them. Eventually, this led to the Seminole Wars. The three wars resulted in the removal of most of the population of Seminoles and Black Seminoles to the Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. Effect of the Revolutionary War. After the Revolutionary War, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain through the Treaty of Paris. This led to Spanish and American settlers coming in, and Seminoles were encouraged to set up farmland because they acted as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the U.S. First Seminole War. This took place 1817 to 1818. When Britain still controlled Florida, they convinced Seminoles to go against Americans who were coming into their territory. With the Seminoles providing to slaves and going against Americans, this caused the First Seminole War. During the war, General Andrew Jackson pushed Seminoles further south of Florida. And this photo is of one of the chiefs, Micanopy. He was not a chief during the First Seminole War, but he became chief shortly after, and then also went on to lead the Second Seminole War. Speaking of Micanopy, he also helped facilitate the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek, signed September 18th, 1823, and it was signed by the Seminoles and the U.S. government. And the terms of the treaty said that the U.S. government would protect the Seminoles if they promised to stay peaceful and law-abiding. And the Seminoles promised to apprehend all slaves and other fugitives found in their reservation. And in return, the U.S. government promised these Native Americans farming implements, like cattle and pigs, and help develop their new land and offer them, education and some money. But the Seminoles also had to promise to let the U.S. government go into the reservation and build roads. Negotiations of the treaty were not upheld by either side, causing the Second Seminole War to break out.
The Treaty of Payne's Landing was also known as the Second Seminole War. This treaty was the result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which required all Native Americans to move west. This treaty was negotiated between the Seminoles and James Gadsden, a negotiator. It allowed some of the Seminoles to travel west and survey the land in Indian Territory that they would receive if they agreed to the treaty. This treaty required the Seminole Nation to move to Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma and leave their current homelands in the middle of Florida. This can be seen in the bright green of the middle of the Florida Peninsula. The Third Seminole War, known as the Billy Bowlegs War, was a series of fights of land spanning from 1855 to 1858. Billy Bowlegs was the leader of the Seminoles at the time and as of 1858 agreed to move his people to Indian Territory. A small faction of Seminoles stayed in Florida under Sam Jones, a powerful spiritual leader, and hid in Big Cypress Swamp. Approximately 3,500 Seminoles today are descendants of this small faction. Once the Seminoles migrated to Indian Territory, they were originally confined to Creek territory. They were allowed to self-govern as long as they abided by Creek laws. Groups of Seminoles, who were former slaves who had escaped from Georgia and migrated south, feared living in Creek territory because they held slaves. In 1849, two of these groups, under Wildcat and John Horse, migrated south to Mexico. In 1856, after 20 years, the Seminoles made a treaty with the Creeks and the U.S. government that established a Seminole nation. This treaty stated that the nation was recognized and protected by the U.S. government. This nation consisted of land between the North and South Canadian rivers. This nation had a boundary on the west where the United States ended and a boundary on the east where modern-day Tecumseh, Oklahoma is. This treaty was signed under the leadership of John Jumper, the Seminole chief at the time. When the U.S. Civil War broke out, the 5 tribes that occupied the Indian Nation also went to war. This included the Seminole, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek. The Seminoles were supposed to be protected from outside invasion under the previous treaty made with the Creeks and the U.S. government, but the U.S. pulled out their troops from Indian Territory, so the Seminoles were left vulnerable to an invasion from the south. Because of this, the nation split between those who supported the Union and those who supported the Confederacy. About a third of the nation, under the guidance of Big John Chupka, remained loyal to the Union and migrated to Kansas to help with the fight, encountering 3 different engagements on their way. The rest of the Seminoles stayed under Chief John Jumper and supported the Confederacy under General Stan Wadey. The war devastated Indian Territory, and once the war ended, the 5 nations who resided in the Indian Territory were forced to give up about half of their land. In 1866, the Seminoles were required to sign a new treaty. This treaty stated that the Seminoles could sell their land for 15 cents per acre, buy previous Creek land for 50 cents per acre, and they had no control over when and where the railroads would be built. This new treaty substantially shrunk the size of Seminole Nation, also known as the Second Seminole Nation, which lasted until 1907. In preparation to make Indian Territory and Oklahoma a state, Congress passed the Curtis Act of 1898. This act dissolved the Native American governments in Indian Territory and divided each nation's land between the members. The Seminole lands were divided between their 3,000 enrolled members. This act, however, did not protect the Seminoles' interests on their lands. Through sale and often fraudulent means, many Seminole members lost their land holdings. In 1920, only 20% of Seminole lands remained in the hands of Seminole members. Some of the few Seminoles who still owned land became wealthy in a 1923 discovery of oil on land that had previously belonged to the Seminole Nation. As a part of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the policy of allotment was repealed. A year later, the Seminole government had been reestablished. On March 8, 1969, the Seminoles ratified a constitution that structured their government in a more traditional way. The nation has since been made out of 14 Itawa, matrilineal town bands, which each represents several towns. This structure is also the basis of the Seminole political and religious life. Each band has a band chief and an assistant band chief who are elected. These bands come together and meet monthly. Each band elects 2 representatives to a general council and is governed by a set of bylaws. The Seminole General Council, run by the principal chief and the assistant chief, is the elected governing body. The chief and the assistant chief are elected every 4 years. Tribal headquarters are located in Wewoka, Oklahoma, the middle of Seminole County. This is an image of former Chief Kelly Haney at the annual Seminole Nation Days Festival in 2005. The group of Seminoles that reside in Florida today are mostly descendants of the small faction that stayed behind in 1858. They use tourism and bingo to pay for infrastructure and schools on their reservation. They own citrus groves and cattle, which are their main source of income. They are very traditional people and live in chickees and wear traditional style clothing and celebrate the passing of seasons. Small groups of Seminoles travel around the state of Florida and visit schools and festivals performing traditional dance and music to share the history of their people. The resilience of the Seminole Nation through the Seminole Wars and the relocation to the Indian Territory led to a successful and thriving tribe within the U.S.